I was struck some time ago when listening to an interview on the radio with Carol Vorderman, who used to do the numbers on Countdown. She was talking about her mother, who, despite having a tough life, was a patient, kind and gentle woman. And Carol Vorderman said that her mother was a Christian with a capital C and a small c. And I was intrigued by this description, a Christian with a capital C and a small c. A Christian with a capital C is a follower of Jesus Christ, someone who has reached that point when they say to God, I believe that you love me and that you sent Jesus to deal with the mess that there is in my life. Please heal me, restore me, forgive me, and give me grace to follow you, to serve you, to live my life for you. That is a Christian with a capital C, a follower of Christ. But there's also a Christian with a small c, and that is, if you like, a moral Christian. Someone who lives their life showing compassion for others, a good person, a kind, warm-hearted person, someone who makes this world a better place. Now, what the Bible tells us is that if you become a Christian with a capital C, then your relationship with God will be reflected in your dealings with others. Being a Christian with a capital C changes you from the inside, and you become a Christian with a small c. And the Bible describes the Christian with a small c in one simple phrase. St. Paul in the Acts of the Apostles says that Jesus taught that it is more blessed to give than to receive. That is, that you're happier when you're giving than when you're receiving. And that natural generosity, that big-heartedness, is a characteristic of a Christian with a small c. And it comes out of, it's the result of our relationship with God. As a Christian with a capital C, we know that we're loved, that God loves us as we are and not as we should be, because none of us is as we should be. We are loved, and we recognize that God has given us so much, that he is so generous, so gracious, that it just flows out of us, and we become a Christian with a capital C and a small c. Now, when Jesus wanted to tell us what a generous, big-hearted Christian with a small c might look like, he told a story about a man called Lazarus. Lazarus is the only person in all of Jesus' parables who's given a name. The Good Samaritan isn't named. The prodigal son is anonymous. No one knows the name of the farmer sowing seed, but Lazarus is given a name. Therefore, his name must be significant. The name Lazarus means the one whom God helps. But Lazarus didn't look like someone whom God was helping. Day by day, he lay there at the rich man's gate. He was always hungry, and he was so sick that he could not stand, and so poor that he was reduced to begging. Life was hard for Lazarus. His friends and family did what they could, and part of their care for Lazarus was for them to carry him every day and place him outside the gate of the rich man's house. Even now, if you go to the Middle East, you will find that on a Sunday, beggars will be carried to churches and laid down by the door so that they can receive something from the generous and kind-hearted people who come to worship. Lazarus was laid outside the rich man's house. This was his pitch, and it should have served him well. The man who lived behind the fancy gates was a very rich man. He could do a lot for Lazarus. Surely we might say today that some of his great wealth should trickle down to Lazarus. But the rich man chose not to help. In fact, Jesus tells us rather a lot about this rich man. It says that he dressed himself in purple and fine linen and feasted sumptuously every day. Now, in those days, purple cloth was the most expensive material, and so even if you were rich, you only wore it on special occasions. But this man went further than that. He wore purple robes every day. So ostentatious, such an obvious and obscene display of wealth. But Jesus didn't stop at mentioning the purple robes, for we're told that the man also wore fine linen, which refers not to his outer garments, but to his underwear. This man wore purple robes that everyone could see and the best underwear that money could buy, as a reminder to himself of just how phenomenally wealthy he was. And it says he feasted sumptuously every day. Every day. So on the Sabbath, on the day of rest, he would make his servants all work hard just to prepare a feast for him to enjoy. The man was a thoughtless, godless show-off, rich but with no compassion, and he did nothing to help poor Lazarus. Lazarus longed to be fed with whatever trickled down from the rich man's table. He longed for this, but it never happened. There would have been leftovers every day, but they probably were just fed to the guard dogs, while poor old Lazarus went hungry. Lazarus was sick, hungry, and covered with sores, but every day people would file past him in order to feast at the rich man's table. Did they not see him? Were they so hard-hearted that they chose just to ignore him? Or were they simply too busy to stop? They did some research once in America. A group of college students were given the task of delivering a talk in 5 minutes' time, and then the researchers placed a person in distress along the route to where they would deliver their talk. What percentage of the students do you think stopped? The answer is just 10%, 1 in 10. The students were all seminarians, trainee vicars, and the talk they were asked to give was on the Good Samaritan. Now the experiment was repeated, but this time giving a different set of students 20 minutes before they were to deliver their talk. And that time, half of them, 50%, stopped. Perhaps the people filing past Lazarus were just very busy. Either way, poor Lazarus just lay there, and even the dogs would lick his sores. Now, I've always seen that as compounding his misery, but actually what the text says is that in contrast to the neglect and the failure to show compassion, dogs would come and lick Lazarus's wounds. Dogs lick their own wounds because their saliva contains endogenous peptide antibiotics, which can help heal the wound. And dogs lick people they like as a sign of affection, as a mark of appreciation. These dogs, street dogs, sometimes vicious wild dogs, maybe sense that Lazarus is good-natured, and so they do what they can to help him and to demonstrate their affection. This scene, I think, tells us a lot about Lazarus. He was kind, gentle, and he lived in quiet harmony with the animal world around him. And there's not a hint anywhere of Lazarus complaining about his lot. He waited patiently for aid and was otherwise at peace with himself and with his suffering. In just a few lines of the story, Jesus has told us a lot about what Lazarus was like, and also what the rich man was like. And then Lazarus died. There's no mention of a funeral, but angels carried Lazarus to heaven, where Abraham threw a party for him. It says he was carried to Abraham's bosom, which meant that he reclined at table, resting his head against Abraham, just as pictures of the Lord's Supper show the beloved disciple resting his head on Jesus. Now, the rich man also died, and he was given a grand funeral, but then he found himself in Hades, being in torment. Now, amazingly, the rich man says nothing to Lazarus, even though he can see him across the divide. No words of apology, no utterance of regret. Instead, the rich man speaks to Abraham. Send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in agony in these flames. What a cheek! For years he ignored Lazarus, and now he expects Lazarus to come running to his aid. Surely Lazarus is all set to say something, to give this rich man a piece of his mind. But he says nothing. One writer says this: the gentle, long-suffering man has no reservoir of anger ready to explode, no reflections on retaliation in the waking hours of the night, no score to settle, and no vengeance to exact. Lazarus is a model of the mercy described by Jesus and recorded by Luke with the words, "Love your enemies, and do good, and lend expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the selfless." When St. Paul describes love, he uses two different words for patience. One means to put one's anger far away from oneself, and the other means literally to remain under, to suffer, to be long-suffering. Lazarus shows both aspects of that patient love. And the thing about this story is that he retains those virtues despite injustice, despite suffering, and despite neglect. It's easy to be nice when everything is good, but to be good when people are not nice is a very hard thing indeed. And yet it's more blessed to give than to receive, to be patient and kind and loving than to be grumpy and mean and cold. Lazarus chose the right path and was at peace with himself and with his situation. And in this story, he shows us something of how we are to be. Although, let's be honest, despite the cost of living crisis and the fact that we are all having to tighten our belts, we still have more in common with the rich man in the castle than we do with Lazarus at his gates. We may not wear purple, although some of us do. We may not wear the finest Marks and Spencer's linen, but we may not feast every day. But we are also not on the streets begging or covered in sores. We are more like the rich man, in which case, though we must learn from the example of Lazarus, we also need to heed the warning about what happens to those who fail to show compassion. It is more blessed to give than to receive. If you give, if you're generous, then you will be blessed. Not just in heaven when you die, but right now you will be blessed. You will know contentment, comfort, joy, because such goodness, such grace brings us in tune with God, and our lives become channels of his love and peace. Our Christian acts with a small c deepen our Christian life with a capital C, so that we love more and feel more loved. It is what they call a virtuous circle. So you see, it really is more blessed to give than to receive. There are tough times ahead for many of us, and we may feel at the moment that recent policy decisions may favour the rich man in his castle more than they do the poor man at his gate. But maybe that simply puts the onus on us to keep an eye out for those in need and to support them, to show mercy on them, to be a Christian with a capital C and a small c. May that be said of each one of us. Amen.